In the summer of 1324, the people of Cairo watched a column of travelers come over the horizon, and what they saw didn't make sense. Thousands of people, hundreds of camels, 500 servants out in front, and every single one of them carrying a staff of solid gold. At the center of it all rode a man most of them had never heard of, from a kingdom most of them couldn't even place on a map. And over the next 3 months, that man would hand out so much gold to so many people that according to the stories, he would break the economy of one of the richest cities on earth. Not with an army, not with a siege, with generosity. His name was Mansa Musa. And 700 years later, he is still often called the richest human being who ever lived, richer than any pharaoh or modern billionaire. Richer, the claim goes, than Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos put together. So rich that some modern estimates put his fortune north of $400 billion, while serious historians say the real answer is that it simply can't be counted at all. Hold on to that disagreement, because it matters far more than it sounds. But here is what almost nobody tells you. The most famous version of this story, the one in your textbook, the one repeated all over the internet, is partly a myth. And the real story is stranger, and darker, and far more interesting than the legend. Because by the time this richest man in history finished his journey, he had a problem nobody saw coming. He had run out of money. The wealthiest man alive was broke. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand what his gold really did to Egypt, and why the version everyone repeats gets it badly wrong. How the richest man alive somehow ended up borrowing money just to get home, and the single cold financial law underneath all of it, the same law that destroyed Weimar Germany 6 centuries later. Because every fortune has a story, and this is the story of a fortune so vast it became a kind of ruin. To understand how any of this was even possible, and how it would all turn against him, you first have to understand where the gold came from. In the 1300s, while much of Europe was trapped in feudalism, plague and mud, West Africa was home to one of the wealthiest empires on the planet, the Mali Empire. And Mali sat on top of something the entire known world was desperate for: gold. At a time before the Spanish had ever set foot in the Americas, this one region supplied close to half of all the gold circulating in Europe and the Islamic world. Half of it. And gold wasn't even Mali's only treasure. Across the Sahara, salt was so scarce it was traded ounce for ounce against gold itself. Whoever controlled those trade routes controlled the wealth of half a continent, and Mali controlled them completely. The man who ruled all of it carried the title Mansa, which meant king or emperor. The 9th Mansa, who took the throne around the year 1312, was Musa, a devout Muslim, a shrewd ruler, and the master of more gold than any single human being on earth had ever personally commanded. For years the wider world had no idea he even existed. That was about to change, because in 1324, Mansa Musa decided to do what every Muslim who can afford it dreams of doing at least once. He set out to make the hajj, the great pilgrimage to Mecca. The only difference was the sheer, staggering scale of it. Picture the caravan that left Mali. The accounts are almost impossible to believe, and we will come back later to the question of how much we should believe them. But here's what the chroniclers described. An entourage of as many as 60,000 people, soldiers, officials, servants, wives, scholars, and merchants, stretched out across the sand. Hundreds of camels, each said to be loaded with hundreds of pounds of gold. 500 attendants leading the way, every one of them holding a golden staff that caught the desert sun. It was not a procession, it was a moving city of wealth, crossing one of the most brutal deserts on the planet, simply to pray. Now I want you to imagine you are an ordinary merchant in Cairo. Your whole life, gold has been the rarest, hardest, most precious thing you know. You measure your success in it. You save it for years. You hide it. And then one morning, a foreign king rides into your city and he starts giving it away by the handful, to officials, to shopkeepers, to beggars in the street. Not lending it, not trading it, giving it. What would you do? Would you celebrate? Or would some quiet part of you start to worry? When Mansa Musa reached Cairo, the most powerful man in Egypt, the Sultan, Al-Malik al-Nasir, invited him to the royal citadel. And immediately there was a problem. Protocol demanded that any visiting ruler kneel and kiss the ground before the Sultan. Mansa Musa refused. He would bow, he said, to God alone, not to any man on earth. For a moment the whole visit hung in the balance, two of the most powerful men alive, testing each other's pride. In the end, they found a compromise, and met as something closer to equals. But that single moment tells you everything about him. He did not arrive as anyone's guest, or anyone's subject. He arrived as the richest king alive, and he wanted the world to know it. And then the gold began to flow. The historian Al-Umari, who reached Cairo a few years later and spoke to people who'd been there, wrote a line that has echoed down the centuries. He said Mansa Musa left no court official, no holder of any royal office, without a gift of a load of gold. The people of Cairo, he wrote, made incalculable profits from him and his men. For 3 solid months, the city drowned in West African gold. And that is where the famous part of the story begins. Because all that gold did something to Cairo that Mansa Musa never intended. Stop and think about what gold actually is. Gold has no real power of its own. You can't eat it. It can't keep you warm. Its entire value comes from one thing, and one thing only. It is rare. The whole world agrees that gold is precious, precisely because there has never been very much of it. So what happens when a single man suddenly floods an entire city with the stuff? The answer is the oldest law in all of economics. When something becomes less rare, it becomes less valuable. Mansa Musa poured so much gold into Cairo that according to Al-Umari, the price of gold itself began to fall and stayed low for years afterward. A loaf of bread, a length of cloth, a day's labor, suddenly all of it cost more gold than before, because gold was everywhere. The ordinary people of Cairo watched their savings, their own carefully hoarded gold, quietly lose its worth. Mansa Musa had not attacked Egypt. He had, the story goes, accidentally devalued an entire empire's money just by being generous. For a while, it looked like a single man had quietly wrecked the richest market in the world, without raising a sword, without a single threat, just gold, and too much of it. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is the exact same force we covered in our story on Weimar Germany, where a government printed so much money it became worthless, and people burned banknotes for heat because paper was cheaper than firewood. Gold in Cairo, paper in Berlin, the same law, 600 years apart. Flood any market with any currency, and every single unit of it is worth less. Mansa Musa ran a live experiment in inflation centuries before economists even had a word for it. And if you're the kind of person who finds this fascinating, these hidden moments where money quietly flips the whole world upside down, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel exists for exactly these stories, and it genuinely helps more people find them. Alright, back to the gold, because here's where the story you've always heard starts to fall apart. For 700 years, people have repeated that Mansa Musa single-handedly crashed the Egyptian economy for over a decade. It's printed in textbooks. It's all over social media. It is the headline of his entire legend. There is just one problem with it. It probably isn't true. At least, not the way you've been told. When modern historians went back and actually checked the numbers, a very different picture emerged. A scholar named Warren Schultz, who spent his career studying the money of medieval Egypt, looked closely at the surviving records, and he found something inconvenient for the legend. Yes, the price of gold dipped after Mansa Musa's visit, but the size of that dip was completely ordinary for the time. The exchange rate in Cairo was always sliding up and down inside that same range, for a dozen different reasons. Wars, politics, the harvest, simple speculation in the markets. The drop people blamed on Mansa Musa was just one wobble among many, and here is the real catch. Out of all the historians of that era, only one, Al-Umari, actually blamed Mansa Musa for a long-lasting collapse in the value of gold. One source. Everyone else who wrote about that period pointed to other causes or barely mentioned his gold at all. So how did a small, ordinary dip become a decade-long catastrophe? The same way every legend grows, the chroniclers never gave real numbers. 100 loads of gold. But how much is a load? Nobody weighed it, nobody counted it. It's like asking someone 15 years later exactly how many coins a king once tossed into a crowd. Nobody truly knows, so the number just becomes more than you can imagine. A short dip became a generation of ruin. A generous king became a one-man economic weapon. The story grew with every retelling. So the most famous fact about the richest man in history, that he broke an economy with his wealth, turns out to be mostly a story we told ourselves. And the real truth about his money is somehow even more surprising. Because here's the part the legend almost always leaves out. Remember, Mansa Musa gave gold away for the entire journey, in Cairo, in Medina, to the poor in every town he passed through. He spent like a man who genuinely believed the gold could never run out. And then, on the long road home, it did. The richest man in the history of the world ran out of money. He could no longer afford to feed and supply his enormous caravan, tens of thousands of people, still hundreds of miles from home. So Mansa Musa did something almost unthinkable for a man of his reputation. He borrowed. He went back to the merchants of Cairo, the very city he had just buried in gold, and he took out loans at steep, punishing interest rates. Sit with the cruel symmetry of that for a second. He had given away so much gold that he pushed its price down, and now he was forced to buy that same gold back, on credit, at a loss. Some say he did it on purpose, to fix the market he'd flooded, But the simpler, more human truth the records suggest is that he had just overspent. The man, remembered for having more money than anyone who ever lived, had to borrow from moneylenders to get himself home. There is a reason this channel is called Fortunes and Ruin. Sometimes they are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same story. Now, I'd be doing you a disservice if I stopped there, because there is one final twist, and it's a heavy one. When Mansa Musa came home, he did not arrive empty-handed. He brought back scholars, poets, and architects from across the Muslim world, including a builder who raised mosques unlike anything West Africa had seen. He poured what was left of his fortune into libraries, universities, and the city of Timbuktu, which became one of the greatest centers of learning on the planet, drawing students and manuscripts from thousands of miles away. By any honest measure, he left Mali greater than he found it. But his pilgrimage did something else too, something he could never have predicted. By parading that much gold across the world, Mansa Musa made Mali famous. Decades after his death, European mapmakers drew him onto their charts, a black African king seated on a golden throne, holding a glittering nugget of gold, labeled as the richest ruler in the world. For the first time, Europe knew his name, and Europe noticed his gold. The very legend that made him immortal also planted a dangerous idea in distant, hungry kingdoms, that somewhere to the south lay a land made of gold, waiting to be claimed. The wealth that built his glory would, centuries later, draw the eyes of empires that came not to trade, but to take. Fortune and ruin, once again, wearing the very same face. So what do we actually take away from the richest man who ever lived? Not the cartoon version, the king who broke an economy. The real lesson is quieter and far more useful than that. It is this: the value of anything, gold, silver, paper money, even the savings sitting in your own account, does not come from the thing itself. It comes from how scarce it is. Make something rare, and the whole world will worship it. Flood the world with it, and it turns to dust in your hands. Mansa Musa never understood that law. Weimar Germany never understood it, and honestly, most people today still don't. We treat money as if its value is permanent, fixed, solid, real. It isn't. It has only ever been a measure of scarcity, and scarcity can change overnight. The richest man in history learned that the hard way, alone on a road home, borrowing coins from the very people he had once showered with gold. He had everything, and he discovered that having too much of anything can be its own strange kind of poverty. So let me ask you this, and I read every reply. If you had been Mansa Musa, riding into Cairo with more gold than the city had ever seen, would you have given it all away like he did? Or would you have understood, where he did not, that the very moment you hand everyone gold, you make gold worth nothing? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if you want more stories like this, stories where a single fortune quietly rewrites who ends up rich and who ends up ruined, subscribe to Fortunes and Ruin. We've already told the story of the hyperinflation that wiped out an entire German generation, and the plague that made peasants richer than their lords. This is that very same law, this time wearing a crown of gold,